everyone, and welcome to the Public Education Panel, Episode 2, Unlearning the Assumed Role When Women Start to Define Themselves. I'm your host, Leonie Moritz, and I'm joined by three amazing panelists as we dig into this topic of Quarter 3 and the rising feminine. I'm joined by my three beautiful guests here today. And starting off, I have Jill Taylor, who is a mother, musician, and spirit-led guide who helps people reconnect with their voice, their bodies, and their sense of inner safety. Known in her community as the Music Mom, she teaches piano and nurtures creativity, both in children and in adults through music-centered learning. She also leads the Somatic Sanctuary, a community space focused on the nervous system healing, embodied awareness, and spiritual connection rooted in Christ consciousness. As a mother of 4 neurodivergent children, her work is deeply shaped by family life, generational healing, and bringing together creativity, embodiment, and faith. Welcome, Jill. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for being here.
And I also have Tam Dillon with us, who is a mentor for the healing arts practitioners, an educator, and the creator of Yogic Tarot, guiding practitioners to integrate ancient wisdom with modern ethical practice. She supports healers building sustainable, well-structured professional paths rooted in depth and integrity. And as the founder and chair of Critical Mass, she stewards a global collective of healers and change makers working to restore dignity and respect to spirituality and its practices, to strengthen community, and to facilitate a global shift in consciousness. Thanks, Tam. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for hosting.
Pleasure. And then we have Julia West, who is currently working as a senior systems thinking consultant in Oxford. She is a creative generalist who supports transformation programs in diverse public and private sector industries, including healthcare, the built environment, energy, and global aid. Her background and areas of expertise are in living systems, agriculture, food, soil, and planetary health. Interested in the intersection of these living systems with human well-being, she has also completed training in counseling, interpersonal skills, and coaching. And she is curious about understanding the patterns that make systems behave the way they do, and in designing interactive solutions that treat complex systems as an evolving whole rather than as a series of fixed or isolated parts. Welcome, Julia, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. So today in our episode, which is falling part of Quarter 3, which is all about the rising feminine, we are talking about unlearning the assumed role. So this episode is going to explore how gender roles have been shaped through social expectation, as well as the patriarchy and the male gaze, and how those patterns continue to influence identity, behavior, and perception. And the conversation is going to look at what happens when women step outside of those expectations and begin defining themselves on their own terms. So in that light, just as an introduction, I'd love to hear from each of you how you experience the role of women and how it's been shaped over time. Just to start us off, Tam, would you like to have a bash at opening for us?
Yeah, sure. Why not? So as someone who loves to poke her nose in a whole lot of history and look at why humans are the way they are and how we've got to where we are, the patriarchal system that we've got very much stems back to like Roman Empire, where we've got that kind of merging of church and state, expansion of the Roman Empire, which was very patriarchal. And if we go further back than that and we look African cultures, Asian cultures, a lot of European cultures, patriarchy was not a thing. We were very matriarchal, matrilineal, matrifocal. So the rise of that Roman Empire and that kind of expansion of it has pushed a lot of patriarchal mindsets into these different cultures, and it's formed this huge thing of control is the biggest thing that comes with that kind of mindset. And if we look at the good old suffragette movements across the world, we had it in the UK, South Africa, the US, the things that they did for us 16, 70 years ago, women can now have a bank account. We can own our own businesses. We can own our own homes. Being able to leave a abusive or unhealthy marriage, like we're able to do those things. Whereas prior to the suffragette movements, we couldn't do those things. It was, and women didn't stay because they were happier. Women stayed because they had no choice. So I think the biggest shifts that we're seeing is that, there is more freedom, but I would say we're maybe halfway through the battle. We've got some of the legalities behind us, but societal expectations are still very much there. Personal experience, my husband I'm busy divorcing from would somehow very bravely say to me, you need to submit to me. And I was like, wow, you married the wrong woman if you think I'm going to submit to anybody. But there is that kind of a mindset, and there is different cultural things that come into that. Where I am here in the upstate of South Carolina, it is very patriarchal. Women, are considered to submit. I live in the Bible Belt. And the Bible says, well, actually it doesn't, and I know Jill will back me on that one. And then you go to a different state and it's completely different. South Africa, it's completely different. So culture comes into it as well, and how we're starting to shift. But we're partway through with the battle. We're nowhere near the finish line, I would say.
Yeah, and it's very interesting what you're saying, because even in the law in your state, a woman is not just allowed to ask for divorce. She actually has to prove that she's tried to work her way through the marriage for a certain amount of time. Am I right? And it's 2026. It's 2026, and our mothers were not allowed to open a bank account without a man to co-sign for them in South Africa. That's one generation back, and it's scary to think that these things are still happening in your state.
Yeah, in my state with the divorce law, you have to live separated for 12 months before you can file.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. And then even then, they have ways and means to stretch it out.
Yeah, but regardless of abuse or proof of abuse, physical evidence having been submitted, you still have to follow that process.
With physical abuse, if you have a strong enough case, you can get grounds for immediate divorce, but you've got to have a solid case. And from what I hear, female judges in South Carolina are apparently some of the worst to step in front of as a woman. They will not have your back as a fellow woman. They're like very traditional values. You're breaking up the home, whether you're arriving with photos of bruises or not. And that's where in my instance, it wasn't, there weren't bruises, but there was absolutely abuse going on. But because it wasn't life-threatening in that nature, it was just emotional, physical, and the fact that, like, he got in my face, financial, psychological, that's not good enough for the courts. So, like, no, you must just be separated for 12 months. Maybe you can reconcile.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, I mean, this topic is so needed, right? I mean, that's a very real life example that we're having. And just going back to the gender roles, it shows, both the visible and invisible ways that women are conditioned to perform their identity through roles and through responsibilities and obligations, instead of just inhabiting their identity for themselves. So just going back to that, Jules, would you like to chat to us a little bit about how you see how women's roles have been enforced, and anything that you want to add to the question?
Yeah, Tam, I really loved that you spoke about the sort of more physical, easily observable history of the Roman influence and of religious influence on the control of women. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is the subtle reinforcements of how women are supposed to behave. And I have a quote from it's from Tara Westover's book, Educated. She says, "There was a single line written by John Stuart Mill that when I read it moved the world. It is a subject on which nothing final can be known. The subject Mill had in mind was the nature of women. Mill claimed that women have been coaxed, cajoled, shoved and squashed into a series of feminine contortions for so many centuries that it is now quite impossible to define their natural abilities or aspirations." And I think there's so much in both the way that we're told to be overtly, this is what a good woman is, this is what a good woman does, that the highest forms of achievement for a woman are to be a good wife and a good mother. Not to say that either of those things are not incredible in their own right. They are really, really important. But there's so much more that I think is pulled away. There are relationships that we build outside of motherhood or a nuclear family. There are works or arts that we might be called to or inspired by, or hobbies that we want to be invested in. And I think it's so important to recognize that we are only one generation away from that severe oppression of not being able to own our own bank accounts or be educated freely or have our own money. And I think the that is breaking. It is slowly breaking. But the softer, more subtle influences, I see more and more women not getting married or not choosing motherhood or choosing different sort of features of family, rather, not having a sort of heterosexual, heteronormative marriage. But I do think so much of that battle is for our own right to self-determination, and there's still a lot of way to go there.
It's fascinating. That quote was power, Jules. That's amazing. And it's true, it is difficult. How do we define ourselves as women? What does the word woman even mean, And there is a time in our lives, and I think our generation specifically has had this burning urge to ask the question, who am I when I'm not performing as I was taught to be? So much of womanhood has been historically shaped around the expectation, how to behave, how to look, how to soften ourselves, how to be chosen, how to be accepted. So what really happens when we step outside of these defined roles? And like you say, that as she said, it's so difficult to actually define that, especially if you're going outside of the norm. So Jill, please weigh in on as a mum and as someone who has fought the role that was forced upon her at different times in her life. Let us know what you think.
Yeah. First of all, I really want to say I really appreciate the conversations that Critical Mass is having. And I also really appreciate the different perspectives that come in, because like I'm sitting here with women that are very educated and can talk about all of the cultural history and all of the background, and I can talk about a lot of life experience and the Bible really, really, really well. But with that, it brings in a whole different kind of angle. So my perspective may not be as clear spoken, but also I think it is so important, and both of these women have already touched on it a little bit, but from my experience and my perspective, one of the biggest reasons we're having our struggle with this shift is largely rooted around what the Roman Catholics did with the Bible when it was getting put together. And it doesn't all just come down to religion. It comes down to control, the patriarchy, all of those other things. But the way that religion specifically has been used in so many different types of political movements, in so many different types of governments. Obviously, we're watching this heavily right now, way right versus left here in the United States. And it's not even right versus left. That's what none of this is about, right? But when you use something like the Bible, and I can't speak on other religious texts. I don't know how they're written. I have come to appreciate other religious beliefs very deeply, but it's because I can see the parallel with Jesus, and that's where I pull from. But I know in how that Bible specifically was put together, women were not included in it, period. And it's... When you think about, I was actually just talking about this with my mom yesterday. My dad, for context, for people who don't know anything about me, my dad is a pastor. I was raised within the church my entire life. I was on the platforms. I'm the oldest daughter of our family. And I had 4 children by the time I was 22 because no one taught me how my body worked, and I was already married. That was just what I was born to do. So for context, this is kind of where I'm coming from, and I've broken out of all of that. I'm in the process of finally divorcing the person that I was married to. We've been separated for years, but he's no longer with our children. Like, he's nowhere around. And from my experience looking at how we were taught the Bible, how people like my dad as a pastor were taught the Bible, the theology that's been passed down, there are no focal points on the women. There are you look at Jesus, and some of his closest followers were women specifically, but when they put the Bible together, they intentionally left texts out that the women either wrote or they were referenced with power. Mary Magdalene is a huge line I could go down for a long time. A lot of her teaching should have been in the Bible, but also from my perspective, if the Bible is not put together in this very patriarchal, raw way, and we don't learn it the wrong way first, there is no reason for a second coming, like Christian nationalists so heavily believe. Now, I don't believe any of that theology anymore. I have crazy theology that's very, very out there, and it does not align with that. but there's no reason for Jesus to come back if we miss the unless we miss the message, you know? So, and from my perspective, while that book can be, it's read at the frequency which you're emitting. So if you're emitting love, you're going to get love from it. If you're emitting fear or that control, that's what you're going to get. But from my perspective, God, universe, I call him Jerry, whoever the hell is up there, is too, we're all too connected for it to just be so white and black that you have to learn it a certain way. But that means that that Bible has to be able to reach the people that are still stuck in the patriarchy while they are in the patriarchy in different moments. And that's how I learned the Bible. That's why I still love it the way that I do. But when it comes back to like this gender role thing, it is a major issue, because even women that are trying to wake up in their own, and I'll speak on Christianity because it's my experience. I'm watching it within my own family all over the place. Women are waking up, but it sounds and feels so contradictory to what we have been trained for generations here in the United States specifically to do, because either your great-grandparent has an influence in the Bible stuff, or you're currently in it, or it's just a couple generations removed. I currently live in Northwest Indiana. I'm about an hour outside of Chicago. I was born and raised here, but because of Bible Belt influence that came up here in the 70s, it is very right-wing. You know, like Indiana is one of the most reddest states in the whole country. And it's largely because of that book. And it's so important to bring awareness to these things. But also for me, it was so hard to break out of that. And I think that's why we're having a struggle in this shift, because the women that are starting to wake up, like, I personally know what that has cost me in the last 6 years since I walked out of that church finally in 2020. I had that, like, COVID is what woke me up. And I left my husband a year later with 4 small babies who hadn't even started school yet. Like, that's a whole, I'm going to write books one day, I'm sure. But like, after going through that for myself, my story is a dime a dozen in those circles. There are 10 other moms that I could sit down right now with that had babies so young and started their lives, and like they paid like their job. Like my husband and I had a routine. He made the money, I paid the bills. But when it came time for me to actually find some stability, I was basing my life around the version of Proverbs 31 that they had taught me. I remember sobbing and begging God to take away my voice and make me meek and humble, because I thought that's what the Proverbs 31 woman was. No, screw that. That's a whole sermon right there. But now that I understand what the Proverbs 31 woman is, it talks about women that take care and go out and do and plan accordingly and like take care of their family, and like strong matriarchal type energy. And even the beginning of that chapter, it talks about how this was given by a prophetess, and that's nowhere referenced. No one gives, but when you pass this down for generations, and you have people like me that are born and raised in it, you have people like my mom who, her trauma, Jesus saved her from her trauma, and it gave her a whole different kind of layer. That's a different kind of a monster, and the awareness and the compassion that it takes to be able to come out of that. The world doesn't have much compassion for me. Yeah, you know, the circles that raised me, they don't like that I'm back up here, and that's fine. But being able to stand, like I think you were talking about, Jules, I loved that quote. I absolutely love that quote, because I'm sitting here now with much more balanced energy, so much in my healing and my spiritual journey. But I'm not this soft feminine person anymore. You know, I'm not living in my masculine anymore. I very much was for a little while. But it's kind of like I'm a Jill of all trades. I love using it because it's a chameleon type thing. But at that point, how do you define what a woman is? You know, I'm walking through motherhood in a different kind of way right now. My youngest is 9, and I've got another on the way, which is very exciting, and it isn't very public yet. But with it relative to right now, I'm building a lot right now. We've moved states. I'm managing a cafeteria right now, a school cafeteria, because it's the income that I need for my family. But I have people around me that are like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I'm like, no, I am woman. Hear me roar. We can do these things, be balanced, because this energy is sitting in us one way or the other, and it's got to go somewhere. But also, this is how the matriarchy gets rebuilt, and nothing changes until something changes. So, yeah, thanks for bringing me into the conversation, because this is where I am at with it.
Yeah, I can hear your passion about it for sure, and it's very valuable. Every perspective is super valuable, and I love what you're saying about, you know, the role of women being misread or actually left out of the Bible completely. It's been made obsolete. There's a more it's a more educated word, but I can't think of it right now, where it's just, it's been hidden. And I saw something the other day which popped up as you were talking, and it was saying they say that women came from Adam's rib, but the truth is every man came from a woman's womb. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. And I don't want to say that we're bashing men, but let's remember who the life givers are. Let's remember what the womb is for. Let's remember what the magic is about. And I think one of the biggest things about stepping outside of the roles which were used as forms of control and to diminish women, and their magnificence, I think men really fear that, or the patriarchy rather really fears that, because they imagine that we will do to them what they've tried to do to us. And I don't think women actually seek that. And Julia, you've spoken to me about this before. So do you have anything to say about in terms of that shift in equality? Sorry, it's just came up now.
I think so. I have this theory about oppression, that the way that oppression works is it tells you that you have to go, you can't be a human being because of this identity thing. So, you'd have your human rights, but you're a woman. You'd have your human rights, but you're of color or you're queer. And I think what happens to us is that we become our own oppressors, and that we say, oh no, in order to become a human, to acknowledge myself as human, I have to consolidate my womanhood. I have to consolidate my sexual orientation, my color. And I think the most important thing is the human first. And the key to our liberation is like, I'm a human first and foremost. And I think a lot of what's happening in that process is the recognition of there are masculine and feminine elements in all of us. There are masculine and feminine expressions of different states. And I think particularly for a lot of women, the story that we've been sold about what a happily ever after looks like is like you're sort of a helpless princess, and then you get rescued, and then that's it. There's no self-determination afterwards. There's no creation. There's no invention. And I think women are, I mean, for myself and a lot of the women that I'm friends with, there's like a real rage that's coming out of that, where it's like, actually, I want to decide who I am. I don't want to fold into some idea of who someone else has told me to be. And Jill, it made me think a lot about like there are very few role models for women. Not that they don't exist, but they're not publicized, right? They're not published. They're not spoken about. And so I think for many women, we're kind of taking on the role of self-determination, almost as I think we lean too far into the masculine and then we start to consolidate it into some whole. And I think maybe men are still learning how to do that. I think leaning into the feminine is really hard because it's been an oppressed space for so long. Because to be vulnerable is to be violable. And I think so much of men's identity in the patriarchy is that they are told to be impervious, which is a tragedy because to be a human being, like one of the most incredible things about being a human is being able to share vulnerability with others and to be able to grow through vulnerability with others and to be able to be a safe place for other people to be vulnerable as well and to witness the transformation that happens in that space. So I think that the whole space of gender roles is really is shifting, but there's still so much resistance to it, right? And I think in part it's because maybe because we don't know just how powerful we could be. Women have been shaped, cajoled, coaxed for so long. We don't know what we'd be without the definition or without the cage. And maybe for men as well, without the cage of you have to be ultra super macho. What does that relationship with the world look like? And I think that kind of the core of that is self-responsibility, right? It's a space where you have to very consciously decide who you are and who you want to be, where and that process is not, you don't take for granted. It's not like a switch where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to be this person. You have to participate in that process, right? And let it change you. And I think that's something that we're waking up to. I think people are definitely stepping into that. Okay, who am I? How am I showing up? What kinds of choices am I making? How am I seeking or creating balance? But it's not easy, and there aren't models for it. And I don't know how many people have done it before. It's certainly not sort of culturally accessible or published.
Yeah.
I would love to jump in on this a little bit. Oh, this just got my wheels turning. So my background is in the Bible, and everything that I witness in the world just relates to what I know there. This masculine, this unhealthy masculine that we're seeing, that's very patriarchal, right? From my experience, that was so much how Jesus was presented in the way that they preached, which is very ironic because Jesus is actually a very, very feminine person, like very, very feminine person. But you have to read the Bible from a layer of love to be able to see that. Otherwise, you're like, and so for the place that I come from, I'm not saying that they do not have love in their hearts, but because of the way that the theology has been taught for so very long, it just gets misconstrued no matter what congregation you're sitting in, at least in those particular circles that I was raised in. But the way Jesus is presented, he's a carpenter's son. He can carry a cross, like he's this strong guy who's performing miracles and flipping tables. But the reality is, if you follow Jesus around, he is admonishing and like putting his disciples, who are 12 men, in check the whole time. And also run with this theory, the 12 disciples as your different parts. And Jesus is talking to the different parts of himself and being like, no, doubting Thomas, I see you and I recognize you and I need you. You have a seat here. But like when you look at your masculine parts, those protectors that want to come and take place, Jesus had all of those things. But by the time we see him on the scene, he had balance with them all. But when he meets people, he saved that kind of emotion and that kind of thing for the patriarchy. That is what he went after. That's why they crucified him, right? But when when you teach Jesus that way for so long, and the Bible is pieced together, the New Testament specifically in the way that it was, I did not learn until in the last year of my life that none of the New Testament words in red were written as Jesus was actually there. That almost broke my brain. The Bible still meant something to me when I learned it the incorrect way. I was still able to get something from it. And I think that's one of the cool things about spirituality is that it will speak however it needs to in the moment to you. But also learning it from this healthier, actual, contextually accurate history, like it makes the Bible that much more powerful. And you were talking about how there's not any literature to back up these women of these types. I would argue that they are all over the Bible. They're just not named. Probably in the last 2 years specifically, I had a very spiritual experience about a year and a half ago, and I met what I call my big. I think it's like my purpose, my soul, whatever. But I realized why I've had all of this craziness happen, why my energy is so big, why I have all this passion. And it's because I'm here to do something big. And when you were talking about women like trying to find themselves in a box, it's like we put God in a box, but we're putting ourselves in boxes too. And when you take God outside of the box entirely, for me, when I did that, I was able to look back in the Bible and be like, oh my God, why are we saying, what would Jesus do? We need more Marys. We need the person that raised Jesus. That's what we need right now. Like we're saying Moses didn't change the world in the Old Testament. I love Moses. I love the story of going back and let my people, I love the whole thing. But if Moses' mother does not break down and put that baby in a river, that story never happens. And that woman, like because of the way the universe works, she ends up going back to volunteer her time and still raises her son, but doesn't get to claim it as her son. But it completely changes the trajectory of Egyptian and Israelite history entirely, whether you look at it from the context of the Bible or bigger picture. So I would personally argue, because this has been the rock that I've been standing on for a couple of years now, I can't let this woman thing go, because there are too many women in that book that absolutely change the trajectory of whole things around them, and they barely get named. They barely have a chapter written about them. Esther has a book, but the book is 6 chapters long? Are you serious? Esther, it's so much there. But if you take the Bible as literally as I learned it, there are miracles, and that is the most woo book there is. You want to take it literal, let's do something about it. This is a book of magic, and it is showing you right here what we are capable of doing as humans. Whether you believe in the specifics of it or not, there's lots that can be argued, but from a spiritually empowering perspective, when I look at that now, I'm like, nah, man, it's just our turn. We got to rewrite it. We just got to rewrite it. Just from a different perspective, but that, for me is the literature, because when you look at people like Joan of Arc or different women, feminine characters that did make huge ruffles in history and change trajectories, there's not a ton of history. They would much rather it be a dude. So
Yeah.
at that point, we write history ourselves. We make it happen. We show them where it has been there the whole time. No one has named it. But until someone names it, it stays unnamed, you know?
I think that's such a powerful thing that you're saying there, Jill, because if you think about the feminine energy, if we go a little woo-woo just for a second, the feminine is unconscious, right? She is, the goddess is wild and she is untamed, and sometimes she's unspoken because she's recessive and she holds, and she's the dark waters, she's the unknown, she's the mysterious, she's all those things that are difficult to name and to speak. And it's the knowing, and it's women's intuition, it's women's guts, it's all of that kind of stuff that we are all born with. Whether you've birthed a child or not, you have the womb, you have that energy, and that makes you something magical. And I'm not trying to say that women are better than men. Maybe I am slightly, but I'm not. That's not my aim. But I'm just saying that there is something that becomes difficult to. I think the idea of woman is so big and so massive and so ancient also, that it runs in our bones, it's in our teeth, it's in our blood, it's in our waters. And whether men like to accept it or not, or whether the patriarchy likes to accept it or not, they came through those waters in one way or another. And so it really has an important, it's an important thing that should be more publicized, but it's difficult to publicize it. And then, of course, it's something that we fear because it's something that we can't quite articulate properly. And I think that is, it just invites a lack of chaos, invites a lack of control and potentially some chaos. And as women, we know how to deal with it, but I think the patriarchy at large doesn't. And talking about Jesus specifically, when you say he's a feminine person, what came up for me is that he was the embodiment of compassion, which is a female emotion. Let's be honest, men struggle to embody compassion. And again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to them, but the absolute empathy of putting yourself in someone else's shoes or feeling someone else's pain, which some of our feminine healers have expressed the ability to do that, to actually feel the physicality of someone else's experience, the emotions of someone else's experience. That's a very feminine thing. And like you said, Jesus was doing a very different job to what they publicized in the Bible, you know? So Tam, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this as we firing up here. And also I'd like to talk about the rage after that someone mentioned at some point. But what's coming up for you, Tam?
Oh, there's a couple of things coming up. So there's the two conversations that I had last quarter with the religious deconstruction, and I chatted to Paula Barlow, who grew up in the Latter-day Saints, one of like the very well known. There's an entire documentary about them, about the cult that was dismantled, and her experience in growing up in that. And one of the very prominent themes that kept coming up was stay small, stay quiet. Be as tiny as you can possibly be, but yet the woman did everything. She's like that. She actually could not name a single thing that her dad did. I've got no idea. He had no part here. He had no role here. The mom was the mom and the dad, but yet you must be submissive and quiet and small. And that thing came out of another conversation with her name has escaped me for a second. It'll pop up for me. But it was the same thing, be small, be quiet, don't allow yourself to be seen. And if I think about my mom and how she raised me and the differences in how her and I would do a relationship, she would keep quiet to keep the peace. But I would always question her, but what about your peace? And she's like, no, that doesn't matter. The external piece is more important. And for me, I'm like, fuck that. No. Because when
Sagittarian, guys, Sagittarian there.
Look, there's a little bit of the rage coming up we're going to chat about in a second. When we think about we've said it, the woman is the creator. We bring life. We're not from Adam's rib. Adam popped out of a woman's vagina at some stage. That is how Adam arrived on this planet. And that recognition needs to be part of the story. Parts need to be put in the right places. and power needs to be given back to the right people for the right things. And as you rightly said, Yoni, it's not about women being better than men. It's about shifting the rewrite of the inaccuracies that have been put on women for so long. And that there is a huge amount of power that comes with the feminine. With you and I being pretty well versed in tarot, if you look at the High Priestess and the Magician as perfect examples of this conversation. So your magician being the masculine, the yang. He's action. He's going to go out there. He's going to build your house. He's going to do all the things and make all the things happen. And then you have the high priestess who holds all the knowledge. So the magician wants to know how to build the house. He's going to go and chat to the high priestess and say, hey, how do I do this? Because she holds the knowledge. So there you actually have what we talk about in my first episode for this quarter with Heather Seipel. Her and I chatted about this, and she speaks about collaboration. How a relationship shifting forward in becoming healthier and stepping away from this. Women are submissive, men are in charge, men are in control, men are the leaders. We joked, a man can barely lead you across the street, let alone run your household. Like you said, it's about coming and making a collaborative version of the masculine and the feminine. And I think that collaboration starts with the self. I think, Julia, you had mentioned it, that every single human on this planet embodies masculine and feminine, yin and yang. That is how we are composed. We all have magician, high priestess archetype to us. Some of us lean a little bit more to the other side. Some of us lean more on the other side, depending on who we are, our nature, our constitution, our role here. I know a handful of male practitioners that are very yin based, very, very yin, very solid in their feminine aspect. And they thrive there. So, that just takes gender roles and kicks it out the window and says, our gender roles is a lot of crap. But because we've for so many centuries been forced to conform, the Bible has been a huge factor in that. Colonization, the Bible and the Roman Empire have been huge enforcing that, this is where the woman sits. And I think it's because they did realize, probably when they went and took over a lot of the pagan cultures, they were like, whew, this woman, we need to do something about them, and good old King James was like, we're just going to burn them at the stake. But it is because there is a very powerful aspect to our yin, and everybody carries that power within them. And I think that's one of the things that patriarchy kind of runs on, is they probably have that knowledge and they've used that knowledge to their advantage, and they're like, let's show it as being masculine. It's male authority, but chances are they're thriving on that yin power source is where a lot of that is coming from. So what Jill is saying with the the parts of the Bible that's a book that should be rewritten once more, and rewritten more in fact than man's perception. There's entire stories that are missing. There's good old Lilith, the original, prior to Eve. And the way that the Bible starts with demonizing woman. Eve is the root of why humans suffer. We all have sin because of a woman. No, we all exist because of a woman.
We all have self-choice or enlightenment or whatever the apple represented. Yes. That Eve went after. She was like, self-enlightenment, I'll take it. Choice, I'll take it. Freedom from the garden, I'll take it.
yes, that's it. And that's that self-determination, right? And I think that's probably like the stage that we're heading into with the feminine rising, is that self-determination. How do we define ourselves as the feminine? But there's got to have the recognition that there is we all carry these aspects in ourselves, and the feminine rising is hugely uncomfortable for men because it's something new. They haven't seen a woman in power ever in their lifetimes, unless they've grown up in a culture that is very matriarchal, and they still exist. There's plenty of matriarchies on the planet. With Western society, they're not accustomed to that. So you have this huge feminine upsurge, and men are like terrified. They're like, oh my God, the women are gonna, burn us at the stake next. And it's like, no, that's the misunderstanding of the differences between patriarchy and matriarchy here. And it's a shape difference. Patriarchy is this, You know, matriarchy is that circle. You know, matriarchy is egalitarian. Everyone is exactly the same. Julia, you said it perfectly. I'm human first.
Yes.
And then I'm everything else. But like when you're like, who are you and what are you? I'm human. And I think the South African term Ubuntu is a really great one. You know, I am because we are. You know, and that's the thing. It brings everything down to humanity. You know, it's not I'm a woman first. No, I'm a human first, and we all need to be treated as such. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now.
No, I love what you're saying, because I think it's so important, especially the Ubuntu concept, you know, that is village life, you know, in Africa. And I just wanted to say, one of the things that you were talking about, it was actually something that Julia mentioned to me before. I forget who the author was, but she was saying, you know, when women look at their idea of heaven, Jules, help me out with this one. But when you look at a version of heaven through women, everyone is cared for, everyone is fed, everyone is healthy, there's enough for everyone. Whereas when you look at a male version, what was the contrast, Jules?
Let me find it and come back to you.
Okay. But it was different. It was like women have this idea of compassion and togetherness, and, you know, they are still, even in our role that we are trying to fight against, we are still collaborative, you know. And then Jill, you wanted to pop in on that. You also had something you wanted to say.
You were talking about, Tam was talking about the patriarchy and just the control around it and how they don't want women in charge. And while there is a lot of that, I think for the people way up that know all the secrets that the whole world doesn't know yet, type of thing.
Yeah.
From my perspective, it's just a bunch of grown men running around like five-year-olds that are terrified, you know? And it's not because they're afraid of women necessarily, but to be in the feminine energy and to be in that kind of flow takes so much discomfort to get to be whole with oneself, whether you're icky or not, you know, that kind of mentality. And even that whole, like, I would love to hear the rest of this thought, where this idea of heaven is going, because from my perspective, so much of the things that the patriarchy wants is because it makes sure that their checks and balances are taken care of, and that there's no faith in it, there's no trust in it, or there doesn't have to be. They can rely on logic brain and the numbers, and while that can help certain systems, it has built a whole different system of fear underneath all of these men, and they don't realize they're standing on it, or that they don't realize that's what they're actually afraid of. It's not women. It's, if we let a woman be in charge, we're going to have to face our own emotions too, and then what if they're right? You know, there's that layer. But yeah, I think it is so much rooted in fear, and it displays as control, but it's a bunch of grown men running around with daddy issues or kid issues, you know, and they need them sorted, but there's no feminine energy in their lives to help them sort that out. You know, there's no balance for themselves.
And it's so funny. I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, but they say that the opposite of love is fear. So how are we preaching Jesus's message, you know, out of fear? Like,
okay, I love that you said that. So there's actually 3 different versions of the word fear that are written out in the Bible, but when they are translated to English, you only get the word fear. I'm actually doing a bit more studying, getting ready to release a whole series on this because it's really enlightening. When you see the word fear in the Old Testament, I believe the translation is like it's via Hebrew, but it's very, I don't know. I have to have my notes out because it's all jumbled up there. But there's the 3 different ways. There's one that's like an agape, all-encompassing love. There's one type of fear, but like that's the fear that it's talking about. Antithesis of, what am I thinking of? What's the verse? Thank you. 2 Timothy, my life verse. For God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. That one verse, that's my life verse, right? But that spirit of fear, that word fear, that's the only context that one translation is in the whole entire rest of the Bible. And it's this idea of things that are controlling, that are shameful. When you look in that's what it was. Thank you. The other 2 that are in the Old Testament, there's 2 different versions in the Old Testament. And one is fear that's like reverential awe, like you're standing on the edge of a cliff and you feel fear in your body, but it's more like it's because you understand the greatness that you're in front of, you know? But that is a healthy kind of fear. And so when Proverbs, thank you, all this is coming right now, and I'm not planning to go anywhere with any of this, but this is why it gets so misconstrued, because when they translated all those different versions and all the different texts, those 3 different languages, into the English that we have, It's just fear. And so like the book of Proverbs, that is like honestly is very feminine energy and wisdom, in my opinion, is a woman. You know, she's referenced as a woman in the book of Proverbs. But they talk about fear as a constructive thing in that book. But that kind of fear is the awe, the reverential, like, but that's not how it's taught. That it's taught that you spare the rod, you spoil the child. You know, it's why I got hit when I was a kid, because they thought that it meant literal fear. You were supposed to put the fear of God into them. Please tell me what the fear of God actually is. That is nowhere in Scripture. That is nowhere in Scripture. But because that one word has 3 different meanings, and the English just have the word fear, that is why that has happened. I can answer that question. That is why that has
That's
happened.
amazing. That's amazing. Just hearing what you said, and no one who's read that book as gospel has not no one, but very few have realized that it's been translated from other languages, and that there may even be limitations to what has been interpreted. That's amazing. So Jules has found the quote. What was the quote, Jules?
Yeah, so the context of it was it's from Glennon Doyle's book Untamed. And she speaks about the role of women in patriarchy as be quiet, be accommodating, be good, um, and how selfish, being called selfish is one of the worst insults that you can give to a woman. And part of that is that if you want things, want is bad, desire is bad. And she sort of reflects and she says, you know, if I think about the things that the women that I know want, the deepest wants that they have for safe communities, for children to grow up happy and free, for loving relationships, for nourishing food, for laughter, for the ability to cry freely when we need to cry. And she says, the blueprints of heaven are etched in the deep desires of women.
So, I mean, I'm just taking a moment, because isn't that a beautiful thing? And isn't that ultimately what women want? And isn't that ultimately what women in power would hopefully, aim for? That is what we want. We want safe, healthy, happy communities. So, on that beautiful note, I'd like to speak a little bit about feminine rage. So Lilith was popped up there. We mentioned her briefly, but we're not going down my soapbox. We're gonna, but as an example of the embodiment of feminine rage, let's talk about how women are diminished through the male gaze. Let's talk about how that makes us feel. And I'd also like to talk about your understanding of internalized misogyny that is in women as well, because I think this is one of our biggest fights that we have, battles that we have. I don't like to use such aggressive words, but one of the challenges that we face as women amongst ourselves is that women have been programmed to view each other as competition instead of sisters, instead of the support networks. And I truly believe that there is a deep type of love, and I mean love in its agape sense, that it's so completely whole between women. Your matriarch mentors, your mothers, your sisters, your soul friends, women that the medicine women that you go to when you're in your weakest, darkest moment or your sickness. There's a love there between women that should be celebrated and documented as a magical thing, because truly I don't know a woman that doesn't go into a safe space with another woman that they feel they care for and can be vulnerable with, where they don't feel lifted, where they don't feel healed, where they don't feel elevated. I think it's we're talking red tent circles, we're talking having a drink with your girlfriends, having a session with a wise woman. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And we've been taught instead to view women as competition, because everyone needs to be chosen by a man. We're all on some kind of sushi conveyor belt as some kind of product. And then also that women are diminished through the eyes of the patriarchy and the male gaze. So I don't know who wants to jump on that one. Tam, do you want to start us off?
Yes, please. I have a lot to say on this one. So I'll speak from my personal experience in the marriage that I'm coming out of. The blatant misogyny and that shift into misogyny that I saw in my husband. He had started watching a lot of the Red Pill Manosphere stuff. Yeah. And he would start to like quote the stuff at me, that I mean, he'd even start to quote a little bit of purity culture, being like, he's not religious at all. In fact, he's one of the most anti-Christian people I could come across. And his whole mindset was that I ran everything. I managed everything. And for me, I'm brand new in his country, but I must figure it all out. I had no help, no assistance. And I went to him and I said, I'm drowning. I'm actually drowning here. I need your help. I don't understand. We don't have kids. How can you be drowning? So the instantly diminishing of the experience, diminishing of the reality that I was living. So that's a lived example of what parts of diminishing can look like for a woman, where our entire realities are diminished. Oh, we don't have kids, you must just cope. And I mean, I have phenomenal coping skills. I have a wonderful toolbox. I've done an incredible amount of self-work on myself, but I'm still human. I'm human first. And one human can only carry so much. And here we have quite a lot of conversation going on. There's one of the influencers, Abby Eckel. I quite enjoy her stuff. She talks about this a lot. And that is the mental load and the emotional load that a woman carries, and that quiet load that a woman is carrying. And it's like you're exhausted. So you're expected to have a job. You're expected to do 50-50, and you're still expected to run an entire household. And men kind of look at household work and they're like, oh, but that's easy. I've got to get out there and I've got to mow the lawn. Dude, you do that twice a month. I do the dishes on a daily basis. Sometimes I do them twice a day, depending on what's going on in the house. I've got to change the oil in the car. Cool, you do that every 3 to 6 months. What about the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis? So you have, again, there's like diminishing of the woman's experience. That is very gender role, that, that the woman manages the house, the man manages the outside. The man is, he would often say, my job is to keep you safe and be the protector. We don't have people breaking into the house on a daily basis. And I mean, for the most part, he would kind of pass out blackout drunk on the couch, and I would be the one to go and lock the door. So if anyone was keeping the household safe, it was actually falling to me. And it comes back to that misogynistic mindset of men are the providers, men are the leaders, but we're still expected to contribute 50-50. We're still expected to have a job, because when we don't, we're hauled over the coals for that. We're not good enough. What are you doing with your life? You're worthless. What are you contributing? And that misconception that doing the dishes and doing the laundry and looking after the kids is just the woman's role. No, collaboration. You've got to collaborate with your partner. We're not living in the 1500s. Also, we don't have the economy of the 1500s, the 1950s. The economy is completely different. So women have to get out and contribute. You can't have a single income household in most countries in this day and age, especially if you have children as well. And so the world has to shift from a practicality standpoint. We've got to shift ourselves. And with the feminine rage, that comes from centuries of oppression. We carry the ancestral stuff inside of us. So we feel foremothers, and we feel it in the earth. If we think about the ultimate mother, which is Gaia, which is earth, I mean, she's been raped and pillaged for centuries, and she has an absolute amount of rage inside of her. So I think a lot of the rage that we feel is so old and so ancient, because so much injustice has been done over the centuries, where it's, you're worthless, you mean nothing, what you contribute is, I mean, I've had those words said to me by my husband, what you do means nothing, you're worthless, you won't get by without me. And in my logical brain, which thank God I had, and that's what kind of kept me sane through the abuse that went on, was, I've done 30 odd years without you. I think I'm going to be okay if I don't have you. But that diminishment comes in so many different shapes and forms. You want to pop into it something, Leonie?
Sorry, just the friend in me was just going to say, and lived in many international countries, run successful businesses in all of those international countries, and currently doing critical. Anyway, continue.
Thanks, friend. See, this is why women need other women, because they're like, and also, and this, like we're here to do for one another. So yeah, the diminishing of the feminine has come in so many different ways, shapes, and forms. And yes, my husband was a dick, Julia. Yeah. I was popped up in the chat. I'm just going to preface that. But he was incredibly eye-opening to live with, because I've never lived in an abusive relationship before. It's my first experience with narcissism, abuse cycles, and all the things. And I would never intentionally have picked someone who was misogynistic in their ways at all, because I'm very much on the opposite side of that. I don't do misogyny at all. And I could see that huge shift in him when he started to watch the manosphere stuff and become indoctrinated by that kind of like bro culture. And I hear some of the things that come out of those men's mouths, and I'm just like, wow, do you talk to your mom that way? The woman, you would not exist without a woman. And a lot of them will say, what have women contributed? Like, dude, you would not be able to watch this episode that you're watching right now without a woman. Wi-Fi, the screens that we're using. There's Marie Curie, there's Joan of Arc, just to rattle off a couple of names. The X-rays would not exist without you. A lot of modern medicine would not exist without women. There's entire lists, and men who have created things would not exist if it weren't for a woman. So
if they weren't born by a woman, yeah.
That's it. So, everything does come back to us, and it's not because we're better. It's that you can't do life without us. You've got to have both sides. You've got to have that counterpart. That's why the collaborative aspect is so important. And men fear the matriarchy, because, like you said right in the beginning, they're so convinced that we're going to have this shape. That's going to be women at the top, and we're going to treat men just like they've treated us. And like part of us is like, we'd like to for a minute, but then our empathy is going to kick in. I'm going to be like, no, we don't need. There's no need for that. We're nicer than that, But we're not looking to put women in charge. We're not looking to do to men what the patriarchy has done to women. And I mean, the patriarchy hasn't served men either. It really hasn't. It's diminished women. It's diminished the feminine aspect in all of us. Men are imbalanced and full of rage themselves. They're full of aggression themselves, because they're not allowed to embrace that dual aspect of themselves. So the diminishing of the feminine is not just diminishing of women, it's diminishing of that aspect in all of us. And that's done no one any favors. It really hasn't.
Absolutely.
We have war and poverty and chaos on the planet because of that. That's where all of that stems from.
So true what you're saying, Tam. And I think I always imagine that if feminine power, or if the matriarchy came back, I imagine that instead of trying to diminish men, we actually already, the rising feminine, I think the question that is being asked is for men to show up, to elevate. And we're not asking, I mean, there are some, women that bash men completely and men are trash, etc., etc. Like, I understand there's that movement, but I think that's just a ricochet from the complete suppression and oppression that we have felt. So that voice needs to be heard for as long as it needs to be heard. But I think ultimately where we are asking men to show up and to elevate themselves is not for our own good, because we've realized we can do all of it on our own, and we have been doing all of it on our own since the 50s, 60s. We are asking for men to rise up for themselves, to meet us where we have always been. I think that's the biggest thing that would be different in the matriarchal society. But yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Jules, as well, in terms of feminine rage and how you feel that women have been diminished or minimized through the male gaze.
Yeah, so to understand the male gaze and its effect, I think it's really important to understand what the gaze sees. And it sees women as two-dimensional. They're objects for sex, for producing babies. They are objects we're objects of desire through the male gaze, right? And the problem with the male gaze is that if you play into it, you benefit from it. If you are agreeable and sweet and demure and the right amount of sexually available, you are affirmed by it. Men will say, "Oh, you're a good kind of woman. You're not so difficult like those other women. You know, you're so easy. You're not emotionally so difficult." And I think there's sort of a training that happens in women from a young age all the way through, where it's not just about the desirability as a wife or as an object, as as the thing to sit on the arm, but it's all of the do as I say, comply in the right way, but don't be too pliable, but don't be too resistant. Like there's so much force and shifting that ultimately I think let me speak for myself. I felt like I had to comply with that. So I end up with this voice inside my head that's like, why am I just not good enough? I can't, I'm too much of this, I'm too much of that. I'm asking for too much. And the affirmation that happens from men around you when you do play into that is in itself a form of social power, right? And I think what starts to happen, or what started to happen in me, is that I realized that the person I was being asked to perform, or the object I was being asked to perform, was like a smidgen of the human that I am and the potential that I wanted to explore. And so I think the rage that comes out is I'm using a lot of quotes today, but I had a quote from Molly Adler, who has a blog called Back from the Borderline. She says, anger is the immune system of the soul reacting to a pathogen. It's sacred. It's the engine of change. And I think that that's the rage that's coming out is the resistance to being told I'm not allowed to see myself as human because I'm stuck at the door of woman. No, I'm going to start at the door of human and use that to define my womanhood and let my womanhood redefine my humanity in this very symbiotic, circular, matriarchal process. And I think rage is becoming this sort of it's a cleansing fire that's moving through women, not for the sake of expressing anger, right, but as a righteous thing. I think that there's rage that is self-righteous, and I think that there's rage that is righteous. And I think the feminine rage is a righteous rage. It's a force or a heat that drives self-determination, that drives sort of a resistance to the global injustice that we see, the oppression of women and children, the gross abuses of power that we're seeing across the world that are coming from that hierarchical view. And I really think that for most of us, I mean, women are also taught not to. I mean, I remember growing up being told, like, I shout in this house, not you. You're not allowed to get angry. Those are the rules here. And so the resistance that we have to overcome to find that rage, to express it appropriately, and then to move onto the other side of it, which is the soul's immune system has burned through the pathogen, and now we emerge healthy and with resistance to um, maybe the sort of the pathogens of the male gaze. It's a it's a difficult experience to go through, but I think it is essential. It is a form of spiritual and personal recovery to actually allow yourself to feel anger appropriately and to be moved by it.
Yeah, I want to add on to that.
Go, Tam.
Sacred rage is the term that that's flying around at the moment. I think that's such a great definition for it. You know, if we my mentor is really great in breaking down words to help us understand them better. If you talk about the word emotion, it's energy in motion, so it's emotion. And when we have rage directed in the right way, you can make huge shifts, you can make huge change. I mean, if we think about manifesting and magic and sort of the woo-woo stuff, you use energy. So when you're taking anger, which is one of the most powerful energies that we have, and you're directing that and you're channeling it to be a change maker. Martin Luther King is a prime example of that. Where he was filled with rage, and he was like, what is happening here, and this injustice is not okay. But he directed his rage into something productive. And I think there's the difference in understanding, like Julia is explaining, these two different types of rage. And what we're witnessing more than anything is more sacred rage. It's not women just going around and setting fire to everything and burning the world down. We're wanting to push the world in a direction that we have more balance, we have more fairness, we have more justice. Yeah, the sacred rage is a really powerful thing, and I think that's frightening for a lot of men. And for men, anger is the only emotion that they've been allowed to express as well. You know, you don't express vulnerability, you don't express love and empathy and kindness and compassion, but yet those are all human emotions at the end of the day. It's something all of us have the capacity for. We all have the capacity for every single emotion that's there. But because anger is the only emotion, I mean, Julia, like you said, the house you grew up in, I'm the one that's allowed to be angry in this house, not you. So it's very much, we're now gender rolling emotions. You know, and you can't, again, you've got to come back to the human experience of like, we all have this array of emotions. We're all capable of compassion and we're all capable of burning the shit to the ground. You know, it's all in how we're using the emotions, but men are allowed anger and we're allowed to have compassion. We've got to, again, bring that collaboration factor into play.
Yeah. It's so powerful what you're saying, you know, or everybody, because I think that the rise in feminine rage is what women have always been accused of, right? Being wild, untamable, hysterical is a lovely word they used to throw around. And I think anger is something that is unbecoming in a woman as the modern role and the assigned role has been known or has been attributed. It's unbecoming, you know, and yet the truth is that if women, for example, just use a practical example, if women stopped using makeup across globally, the economy would crash. That's how much is dependent on women being beautified. That is how much we drive the world. I don't know the exact percentages, but I think we're more than 50% of the global workforce, for example, things like that. You know, women have such a huge literal imprint, not only in the spiritual world and in the birthing world and all these other things that we're talking about, but just in the physical actuality of existence. And they have such power, but they have been taught to swallow their voice. And I mean, if you watch The Little Mermaid, which we all love, the Disney Little Mermaid, if you watch that story through a feminist lens, it is horrifying how she gives away her voice simply to be able to open her legs for a man. I'm sorry, it's a harsh way for anyone who has to now go and watch The Little Mermaid, but it's the truth. And it is shocking. It is a shocking example of what women have to go through. And it brings rage, but it's a rage that is deserved and allowed, and it needs to be expressed. But I feel that even the feminine race, yes, she may flay you and she may raise things to the ground on occasion, but the idea is to rebuild something. The idea is to create something. Even Gaia, when she volcanoes or does whatever weather catastrophe she does, it's to bring new life, right? Julia's a biologist and a soil expert, and she can teach us more about this. But there's reason behind the destruction, right? So I just want to validate the rage, and it's not to go out and blindless rage. It's like, I have a purpose, but I think it's the voice. It's the voice of the unsung heroes of our time, heroines of our time, and it's the injustices that have never been acknowledged, let alone spoken, but acknowledged, you know, to women and children over the years. And I lost my train of thought. So let's go to Jill, who's going to talk to us about her example of feminine rage and the examples of internalized misogyny and the male gaze. I mean, you've experienced it in the church. Hugely.
I've actually had quite a hands-on experience with this in the last 4 weeks, and I was not. I'm going to share my experience. It's story time. So I was relocated back to Northwest Indiana at the beginning of March. When I say it was a universal move, I mean, I didn't have a car to my name or any money, and God was like, go. And within 2 weeks, I had everything I needed, and we were moving. It was and I couldn't figure out why God was bringing me back, especially to the area that I left that had so much, like, if I was going to come anywhere, it was not going to be back here. Maybe Michigan, but not here, like, not Indiana.
Okay.
And God's like, go. So, you know, I come back, and a month after I get back, there's a church up here that every April has this very big, it's one Sunday a year that's like their homecoming Sunday. They reach out to all the people that have been visitors or members at the church in the past. They have a big potluck. They might bring in special music. But at this particular church, it's a very soulful, like, it's the only black church that I was ever raised around. It's why I could listen to drums. That church was the only one, the only reason. But they know God. They know it in a warped way, but I feel it when I am there. I've always felt it when I am there. So when I realized I was coming back, and I was going to be back right around this week of homecoming, and then this week-long jubilee is what they call it, and it's like a reviving of the church is what they want to do, but it's oftentimes the same kind of preachers in the pulpit, and they've been doing it since I was little. I used to sing and fill in for these kinds of people on the platform, okay? This was like our circle. So I come back, and I don't run with these people anymore, but I had been visiting this particular church because it felt familiar, and I knew the people they love me. Some of these people changed my diapers. I changed their kids' diapers. Like, it's familiar, and while I'm out there, they still love me. And so I came back. But there are some people in the missionaries and the evangelists. There's a lot of people that were very good friends with my dad that knew about the abuse we went through, but because of the patriarchy and what that would have done to platforms, nobody said anything. I was begging for help. There was a lot behind it, and I know all of this. I've spoken on some of this in the last year, but it's taken me 30 years of having no voice and a lot of trauma for it to finally lose it. And I didn't realize in the moment that it was my sacred rage. It started last October. I can't get her to shut up now. Honestly, I got to figure out how to get a bit of a handle on her. But it kind of just started. And so now all of a sudden I'm back here in this area, and I go to this church very open. The pastor knows I am not there to pick anybody apart. I am trying to find the love that I know is in the Bible. I'm trying to find it in the church. And the missionary and the people doing the music are people that know me, like went to high school with my dad, so they know my mental health. They know me very well. I struggled with my mental health all as a teenager. I attempted suicide at 16. The churches were painted to pray for Eddie and their family. Jillian's putting them through something. But that crazy woman mentality started before I ever had kids. My ex-husband kept both of my hospitalization packets because I've been hospitalized twice since having babies for my mental health. He swore that's how he was going to get custody of his kids, because I'm crazy. I'm not, I've done the things that I've needed to, but there was so much sacred rage that was trying to get out. And the narrative that's been in these churches this whole time for me has been, she's crazy. So I'm back in this space, open-minded, and some of the people behind the scenes, they were like unblocking me on Facebook. I mean, missionaries in their 60s, people around the nation support these pastors. And I'm like, what are you doing? This is the Bible you're talking, like, this is so wrong. And they start toying with me from the platform. Nobody in the congregation would have known this, but I know how these sermons work. I know the people themselves. And I went a couple services. I went that Sunday and got so mad because the worship was so open and loving, and I was there in flow with them. And the preacher got up there and started yelling all of this condemnation and hell and fear. And it dysregulated my body so much in that moment. I almost got sick. But I stood up and stormed out of that auditorium. I didn't say anything. But everybody in there knew me. Everybody was shocked I was even there. They knew that I was worshiping, and then all of a sudden I was gone. So I pop in 2 more services throughout the week. And the third service that I come into, at this point, the pastor, the missionary that's been hiding all this junk, I've been calling him out for years. God is taking his ministry down. That is karma happening on its own. I am just speaking my truth. But he happened to be sitting right behind me. And this is very relative to this patriarchy thing. So this guy has known me for my whole life. He's sitting back here. And in the sound booth to my left is also a man I've known my whole life. I met him when I was in kindergarten. I went to school with his daughter. So but he's like a dad to me. And this preacher I don't know starts on this little rant before even opening the Bible about how it's not our job to call out sin and all of this junk. This man was just in the U.S. House of Representatives opening in prayer. And he wants to preach that there's no accountability and that's the job of the Holy Spirit. And I'm knowing that they are doing this because I'm calling shit out on Facebook. I'm being public about my stuff on social media. These are men that don't pay any attention to me. And I snapped. I slammed my Bible shut. He hadn't even started reading a verse yet. And Bill, that dude sitting back there, I keep praying that his system crumbles. And it's not about the men. It is about all of those people in the congregation, because that's all I could think about. Whereas all of these women that love me, all of these women that go through their own kinds of abuses, the man in the sound booth that just does not know any better because he's dense and this is the only religion he knows. But when I stood out of my pew and I just started yelling, I was like, that Bible preaches accountability. I am screaming it at this pastor in front of probably 250 people. That man in the sound booth yelled at me like I was a 5-year-old girl. That man who can't even handle any of the missionaries or any of the evangelists because he sees all of the bull crap. He's known these people my whole life. And I got so mad. But when I left, he and his son, they were hot in my tail. When you go back and watch the live service, you see the pastor's son and a bunch of men leave that auditorium. And I was not planning on breaking down the story, but this is such a perfect example. I did not know what happened right after I walked out. I was terrified, especially when I saw that guy yelled at me. Like I have a lot of trauma, and it is. I don't have control over my rage, but I think there's a point to that. That guy, like somebody's got to be the example, and at this point, okay, I'll do it. Like because it's there one way or the other, and it's safer for my body and my kids if it is out of my body. Nothing is going to change unless something. But I'm sitting there realizing we are all just sitting here listening to this, not questioning it, because no one says you can't. And if I had been a woman standing up and raising my hand and amen and hallelujahs, or I wanted to share a testimony, they would have handed me the mic in 2 goddamn seconds. And they would have called it the kingdom of God. And so I leave, but the things that transpired in the days that followed, and the things that came, like that man that was sitting to my left, that's known my dad, knows my dad's mental health, knows my mental health. He came outside of the church after I left, and I couldn't figure out why. He was waiting for me to show back up. He was waiting for me to be crazy. He was waiting for me to put on a show like my very unhealthy father would have. But from a woman's perspective, it would have discredited every single thing that I have been saying, all of the truth, because all of my truth is filled with emotion and filled with rage. Now, the story is what it is. But I came home, and I have a video on my phone. It's like a minute and a half. I just was sobbing. The adrenaline didn't even kick in until after I was back here in my, like, where I live. Like, it was so clear. It just happened and it took over. But I realized when I left there that from my circles, feminine rage of any sort is not okay. So even women that feel anger, we pray it away. We shove it down because we are taught we're not supposed to have it. From my perspective, the only person in the house that had that expressed anger expressed a lot of abuse with it. And so for me, I was absolutely terrified of my anger when it started showing up because I was comparing it to that of my dad's. But what I am realizing more and more is even these women, none of these women want to talk to me. They loved me before I did that, but now I'm scary because they are afraid of their own rage. They are afraid of their own anger, and they can't interpret that spiritual book for themselves. They have to go through what their husband says or what the platform says, and it's not taught that way. It's because of the way the church is trying to evolve. They're like, no, you can have your own relationship, but it's bullshit. They teach this umbrella mentality where, God is above you, and then the first umbrella is your husband, and then the second umbrella is you, and then under you is the kids. And like that's how the authority of God is supposed to feel. I don't even have umbrellas in my house because of that picture in my head growing up. Seriously, because it is so warped. But also to go through all of that, to understand what actual feminine rage is and know that I was not in the wrong in any of that. Like, I don't care that you're pissed off. I don't care that you're mad. Be mad. But in hindsight, that pastor never missed a beat. He and that missionary were taunting me the whole time. They were waiting for me to pop off. And he said the exact thing for me too. But at that point, if you are going to use scripture like that specifically, that book is very feminine. You guys have just been reading it wrong. And whether it's me that comes in flipping tables or it's someone else, that sacred rage is absolutely how this change happens. But from my perspective, all of this is stemming around the Bible. Like all of even the ownership of women, that is so Old Testament, it's not even funny. That is how Christian nationalists currently cover up rape or abuse or condone it or different things because of stuff that's all the way back in the Old Testament. So when you take those stories, then you bring that into England, then it comes into colonization, all of those layers. You might have a man that is not religious at all, but that has been the thread that has been taught for hundreds of thousands or hundreds of and thousands of years at this point. So whether you realize it comes from that scripture or not, from my perspective, we all came from the similar places, and that book has tons of history in it. But like when you look at it like that, it's such a deep thread, and it is so angering. But from my perspective, yeah, lots of women are waking up, but lots of women are terrified of their bodies and their anger. And that's the boat that I've been sitting in. I'm still coming out of it. Like I had such a breakdown in that video that I took out front of my house. I'm just screaming, I am proud of myself if no one else is. This mattered if it doesn't matter to anybody else, because I knew that nobody else would have, like no other women. And I wasn't wrong. Like I have nobody that wants to be near me right now, but I'm not mad at that. It's very lonely though. Liani, you were talking about that, like charge against women, like we're like pitted against each other in competition. And as a woman who has good supports virtually, I'm so great. I have an awesome, like Tam is my mentor, and I have other people, other women especially. I have a doctor that's very yin based, and he's a male but very healthy in my life. But having to walk this journey without someone physically next to me that understands where I'm at in life, that understands the depth and the severity of the spiritual journey we as women are walking right now, it is so isolating. It is so hard. It is so difficult. And even my partner, who is such, I mean, he's his own healthy male in his course of waking up, so there's hiccups, and it's hard, but it's even hard for him to understand how he's not enough for me. And it's not about needing more in a relationship, or it's not about him not doing something. It is because women do really genuinely empower each other that way, but we are starked so much in fear, or like right now, women are pitted against me because I have no problem expressing my anger. And they don't think that's biblical. They think I should be soft spoken. And I can agree to disagree, but the rest of them can't. And while that is one thing for me, where does that leave all of those people in that collective? Like where does that leave those women that are trying to wake up? And that's for the universe and time itself to sort out. But I think it's why it's such a battle around feminine rage, because Michelle Obama, you guys have both, all three of you guys have touched it on different angles, but she wrote a book a while ago, and one of her concepts in the book is she's talking about feminine rage, and how anger that is not directed towards anything is just energy that's going all over the place. It's just chaotic. But when you can intentionally direct that, and it is directed energy, it is directed anger, it's sacred rage, that's when things change. But so many women, from my experience, are standing in that chaotic state and don't understand what that is. They don't understand why they're angry. They don't understand why they feel crazy. And it's a hard season to come out of. I feel like lots of women aren't able to actually wake up because that is so dysregulating to the body, when that's the only thing the body has learned. Me waking up and giving my rage a voice cost me my legs for an entire summer. I was walking with a cane. I thought they were gone. At this point still, when I have moments that are very big, like I have diagnoses that take over my body and I have no control over them, and it's not my immune system, it's my nervous system, and that, in my opinion, is where all of my rage and anger has been sitting this whole time with nowhere to go. But when you relate that to women who don't have bodies that fully shut down, or they never hit that point of like collapse and they have to start over, you're stuck feeding into the patriarchy. I mean, you got women in politics right now all over the place that are displaying that, but you also have women in spiritual communities that are lost and confused because their body is telling them something completely different than what their pastors are telling them, or what their Bible for themselves is telling them. It's a really sour point for me to stop on, because it's something that needs to be addressed and fixed, but that's why I talk about it, because lots of women, from my experience, and lots of books are written after you've done the healing, after this is how you get there. But I was just talking to my therapist about this before I moved. As someone who has very complex PTSD, no one talks about how hard it is when you are in the absolute middle of healing. Nobody talks about that. There's no books. And I understand why. People in those spaces are not capable of it. I've been hospitalized twice in the last 6 years. It's not been fun, But being on this other side, it's why it's so important to talk about, because those women are, and people, even men, those are the ones that get missed because they don't understand what's wrong with them, why they can't logically get their brain to align with something that they know is right. There's such a disconnect, and that's where a lot of somatic and nervous system work comes in. It's why I've got the somatic sanctuary, and why that thread is open so deeply for me. But that's because we're all disconnected from our nervous system. So if you're a female that's been trained to be afraid of fear, whenever that rage pops up, whether it's because you finally left your ex-husband or not, you're not going to know what to do with it, and it might almost kill you,
Yeah. No, what you're saying is so important, because it is not only disconnected from our nervous system by swallowing our emotions, which we've been taught to do, and swallowing our voice and anger specifically, but you also create dis-ease in the body, or illness in the body as well, when we don't express our emotional stuff. And you get a disconnect from God as well. You're independent, the God in us. We've spoken about this in last quarter as well. So I think it's hugely important. And you just going back to what you said about demonizing the voice, or the resistance, or the questioner, or the seeker, which is essentially what all of those of us who are part of the critical mass space are. And the spiritual space, we're seeking answers to things that the traditional texts have not given us, right? The traditional healings have not given us. We're looking for something else, something more. And if we use Lilith as an example, she was supposedly the first woman, and her pure indignation at needing to kneel or to submit or whatever it was then demonized. She became demonized to bitterness and rage and evil because she simply would not bend the knee. And I think it's so ironic because whilst I'm not well versed in the Bible, I am well versed in rebellion, having a strong Sagittarius Saturn and a strong Mars in my chart as an astrologer. I do not submit. It's not in me. It's just not in me. And I was also raised by an incredibly tenacious woman. So I don't know what bending the knee is. I understand collaboration. I understand as a natural person walking side by side with my gods or deities or things like that to create something wonderful. But I don't, and I'm not saying I don't surrender to something bigger than myself. Of course I do. But I'm just saying submission is not something that comes easily to me. And I think that all women actually, if they're truthful with themselves, they feel that. And talking about the sacred rage that you're mentioning and women not understanding it is because there are no role models and there are no text, but there are people that are doing it. And the rising feminine is becoming a confronting force, not only for men, but for women who have been brainwashed, programmed, living in patriarchal society, internalizing the misogyny and actually using it to harm other women intentionally. Some of them, a lot of this right-wing anti-abortion things, we can go all into it where there's a lot of female-driven stuff going on. But there are those of us having these conversations, creating these spaces which are confronting the question, which are confronting the issue. And I think that as long as we create spaces, the voice will be heard, the message will be shared, and I think that's what we're talking about. But just coming to some resolution on our topic, how do you think what does womanhood look like going forward? What is the sort of resolved way to integrate and define ourselves? How do we move forward? I mean, we've had such beautiful points that we've spoken about, meeting men in a collaborative space, in a circular egalitarian energy, in a matriarchal energy where there isn't exclusion. But what else would you guys add from your own viewpoints about what it means to be a woman and how you're redefining womanhood for yourself, outside of the gender roles we've been given? Tam, do you want to start us off?
I do, and I want to hinge a little bit off what Jill was sharing there with the disconnect with the nervous system, because I think it flows into this next topic really beautifully. First thing I want to acknowledge is something that Jill said that was really powerful, that the man in the back shouted at her like she was a child. And I have experienced that, and I've seen women experience that, and that comes into that submission that we're spoken to like we're children. Like you have no sovereignty, you have no authority, like you are less than, so I'm going to talk to you like a child. So I wanted to just reiterate what's something really important that Jill shared there. And then the nervous system disconnect, where we're taught to be so disconnected from our bodies. So menstruation back in the day was a rite of passage. Giving birth was a rite of passage. Menopause, a rite of passage. Blood was painted on the walls in celebration of this thing that you are now becoming and experiencing. Women come into menopause and they're like, oh my God, what is happening with me right now? And we hate the experience. We will sit in the circles and we'll bitch about it. We should be sitting in circles and honoring one another in those instances. It's the same as girls coming into their menstrual cycles. They should be honored in that. We come into menstrual cycles and it's like, shh, don't tell anyone. Hide your tampons. Don't let anyone see you buying your sanitary towels at the grocery store. And it's
become a dirty thing.
That's a
dirty thing that needs to be hidden. It's a shameful thing.
Yes,
it's a biological function of the body. We didn't choose it.
That's it, and it's a form of initiation for a woman. All of those stages are initiations for women. So there's that side where we need to shift how we have conversations around those things, where it's not, don't tell anyone about your tampons. It's like, walk into the grocery store and be like, bitches, it is my time of the month. What is your recommendation on the best tampon out there? And for menopause as well, I'm definitely coming into perimenopause and I'm like, what the fuck's going on in my body? And unless I'd actually sat and had a conversation with two other women inside the critical mass space, and they're like, what I really hate about perimenopause is the itchy ears. And I'm like, oh my God, that is a thing. Like, my ears have been itching for the last 2 years, and it like drives me insane. I want to shove something in there. I'm like, what is happening? Cool, it's perimenopause, but I wouldn't know unless I'd had a conversation by chance with two other women who are having the same experience. So talking about being woman, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do for ourselves. And I think that the more that we talk and we learn from one another, again, the collaboration thing comes into it, is we're going to move out of these, suppressive states where it's like, hide your tampon box, hide the fact that you're having a hot flush. Women will dress a certain way because they're like, Lord, I'm going to have a hot flush today. I know it's going to come about, and I can't wear that beautiful purple top, because I'm going to get the sweat stains, So again, we're hiding so much of our experience as women, and the disconnect from the nervous system. Back in early 2024, I had so much pressure in my neck from living in survival mode. Firstly, I didn't understand the abuse cycle until I was educated on it. And I didn't understand the ramifications on the body, the nervous system, and the vagus nerve on that. So I had all this pressure going on in my neck that I've had pain in my neck for years now because of the relationship that I was in. And the pressure got so bad, there was like a push down outward pressure that I had to look down and like, am I actually picking my feet up properly? Am I walking properly? Like the disassociation from my body. And like I've had beautiful connection to my body for many years. My spatial awareness, my proprioception. I'm always aware if I'm getting sick, where does it come from? If I'm feeling nauseous, oh, it's because I ate that. So I was always very in tune with my body. Now all of a sudden I'm in excruciating pain. I can't even tell if I'm picking up my own legs. I'm walking properly. And it's because I'd become so detached and disconnected from my body because I was having this diminishing experience going on the outside, where I'm now constantly trying to shift and like bend myself around my environment to avoid, whatever outburst was going to come from that. So for women to start bending themselves out of shape and allow themselves to fill the shape that they actually are, I think is another step in the right direction. So conversations, more women circles, and I know men feel left out and they're like, why have you got all these women's workshops and groups and things? And like, yes, men need to have them as well. When we have goddess empowerment workshops, let men be involved in that. In Hanoi, I've got a really great story that's a prime example of this. So I had a tarot cafe in Hanoi and I would run events and stuff. And then I had a facilitator come in and do a goddess empowerment workshop. And there were, I think, 9 or 10 women who had signed up. And there was a man who reached out and said, I respect that it's a woman's space, but something about this workshop is really pulling me in. And I really want to be a part of this. Is it okay? And he came from beautiful respect. And all the women were like, yeah, sure, why not? Except for one. Nope. Goddess empowerment, women's space only, you're not allowed. And it landed up that she couldn't make it. So the facilitator said, well, let's bring this man in. The one person who had the biggest shift in that workshop was the man. The women were all like, yeah, let's light up papers and, do the thing and, have fun with it. And he was in there and he was doing the work. He came back and saw me a couple of days and he's like, something is weird in my body. Like I'm feeling all these emotions. I'm having these weird experiences. Like I don't understand what's happening. And I think it's from this workshop that I did. And a couple of days after that, he's like, I feel so balanced. And he carries a lot of femininity and he's very, very yin heavy. But there was a woman saying, you're not allowed inside a woman's space because you're a man. So here we're shoving men out and we need to include men in the process. So as much as it's the feminine rising and women finding their empowerment, we've got to remember that it's empowerment of the feminine for all of us. We're all empowering our feminine. We're all empowering that yin. Yes, we have suffered the most as women, and then we go into women of color, definitely being right at the bottom of the rung. So women of color and then women in general, and then men. And then you have those at the top that are pretty much untouched by all of this. The patriarchy serves them beautifully. But patriarchy has harmed all of us in varying different degrees. But we can't cut people out of different conversations because of gender, because we're just conforming to gender roles and we're just perpetuating cycles. So doing away with the patriarchal gender role, moving into more of that we're humans first, and we need to be seeing one another as humans first, and not, what have you got hanging between your legs or you don't have between your legs. And then the conversations about the feminine experience, and without shame. It's not a shameful experience to give birth. It's not a shameful experience to be going into menopause. It's not a shameful experience to start bleeding once a month. Those are how we function. It's part of who we are. And we can't kick that out the door and say, no, we don't want to know about that. That's gross. You're gross. You're gross for not accepting us. So yeah, I think that's my 2 cents, is that we've got to find reconnection with our bodies. And I think Jill sharing her story was really powerful, and the disconnect from the nervous system, because I've been there. Someone who was very in tune with her body at one stage, and all of a sudden I was like, I don't understand what is happening in my body. And I went to go and see a bunch of male doctors, and they were like, we don't know what's going on in your body. Here in the States, they've only started studying the female body back in 1993. That's when we got into medical research.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. All the blood test work and stuff here in South Africa, whether you've got a thyroid or a cholesterol problem, it's all based on men. Even running shoes are based on men, which is ridiculous because women have different pelvises and everything. It's only recently that women have been included in these conversations. But before we start a whole new sermon, I just wanted to talking about the importance of menstruation. In the Bible, you drink for communion. It's the blood of Christ is so sacred and it's so wonderful. When it comes from the man, it's so wonderful. And yet in so many religious practices, not only Christianity or Catholicism, but in others, the period is vilified. The menstruation blood is vilified, and yet it is the life force. It is the life force, but when it comes from Christ, it's okay as a masculine, but when it's from the feminine, it's shameful. And for me, that has always been one of the biggest question marks. And I was a teenager asking these kinds of questions in Bible Ed. We used to have Bible Ed education back in the day, and they hated me because I was like, well, what about, because I'd also read a bit of other texts and other things, and I was like, but I don't understand, especially as a more pagan person where blood and bones is part of everything that you work with. You have to embody your magic, you have to embody yourself in the world. I didn't understand what was so gross. Like, I didn't understand it. And I think the art or the practices of honoring your daughter's first bleed, or the fact that we used to bleed according to the moon and things like that, how to be in sync with nature, it's such a beautiful, reverent thing. I still don't understand it. I've always been very, different from that. So I just wanted to point that out. Jules, what do you have to say in terms of how you identify, or what you think a healthy resolution towards womanhood is now, and getting rid of the gender roles and things like that? What is your way forward?
I'm going to be quite radical, and I'm going to say joy and play.
Yeah.
I think so much of liberating ourselves, we spend so much time in the war of nervous system recalibration, right? Because it does feel like that, but without recognizing that war is supposed to clear a path for dancing. Jill, when you were speaking about storming out, I had an image in my head of like a fire burning a path, and then long after you've left, little green sprouts coming up and very timid animals coming and starting to eat those at that green. So there's no knowing really, like when that process happens, like if you just lean into it and let it happen, there's a transformation that comes through it, and I think so much of that, so much of play is the ability to fail. And as women we're told, the rigor around the shape we're supposed to fill is so intense, that it's really hard to be like, hey, it's okay for me to make a mess of this. It's okay for me to try things and for them to fail. And I think really leaning into that as a form of self-expression, self-exploration, and self-determination is really what's needed, for all of us, for not women or men, but for us as humans to embrace the fact that we feel angry, that we feel afraid, that we feel awe, that we feel wonder, and to lean into that. And I think, Tam, you said at the beginning, it's about a collaboration within ourselves. It's not just collaboration outside. And it's all of these parts of the self that are full of rage, full of not knowing, full of guilt, full of shame, but also the parts of me that are curious and funny and intelligent and full of wonder and full of love and like those are the things. All of that is coming to the table in me now, and then life feels like something that I can explore alongside it. It doesn't feel so much like I, as a woman, have to achieve a certain role, or because I think so much of that definition is women have almost shaped themselves into little men in order to be accepted in the society. We don't talk about emotion in the workplace. I bring my emotion to the workplace. Hey, I'm having a really shitty day today. I'm feeling quite emotional and quite tender. Or I'll bring my emotion into a conversation. Um, I just think I'm tired of feeling ashamed of what is. I've tried every configuration of self to try and avoid um, the shame and the fear, and I've just realized it's not possible. I'm just going to lean into it and move through it. Um, and I think that is when we talked about women being afraid of their bodies, Jill. Maybe that radical acceptance is how we stop being afraid of our bodies. It's like I can feel that kind of rage and I can move through it, and the green sprouts up from under it, and all of us feast from that harvest. And so, yeah, I really want to encourage, I think, all of us as women to allow ourselves to be what we are and to play with that. I think that's really, really important. And to lean into one another while we're doing that, to be curious, to listen, to hold space. Yeah.
That's beautiful, Jules. I love the image that you gave us. Everyone was nodding with the little fire and the sprouts. That was beautiful. And just what you're talking about, radical acceptance, I think for myself, as someone who's, battled with my external image through the male gaze, because I've been someone who's not traditionally attractive in terms of being overweight and stuff like that. The radical acceptance that comes when you remove the shame of how your body just is or how you just look, and learning to love yourself and all your parts, and physical parts as well as your personality parts, and the different, like as Jill was saying earlier, the 12 parts of Jesus. I think that is one of the biggest things, is to actually allow yourself as a woman the space to exist. I am me and I exist. And therefore, that's all. I am being, and I am being me. And that's actually enough. And I think for me, that's what I've done in the last couple of years, is coming into accepting myself for who I am. And it's quite funny because the more I've learned to love myself, the more I'm seeing prettier or better or more acceptable things in the mirror for myself. But it's so funny when I've decentered the male gaze completely, that it doesn't actually matter now. It's amazing how I can soften for myself. And then I've actually seen the physical reality change a little bit, which has been very interesting for me in my experience. But Jill, I'd love to hear from you, how you find a healthier version of being a woman and your resolutions.
So first things first, I walked into Walmart this morning in a t-shirt and no bra on, and oh my God, the amount of looks that I got because my nipples were standing out with and I know part of that is because of the area that I'm in, but the fact that we're having this particular conversation, fuck bras, man. That's the first thing. That and makeup, they went so fast for me. I wear tank tops that might add a little support for me, but that's it. But those kinds of things, feeling comfortable in my own skin, letting myself just be as it is. Part of that was 3 C-sections, being cut open for so much and just being exposed in such a short amount of time, which was very traumatizing for someone that's been taught to cover my body, if I'm super honest. But it gave me this headspace of just this is just a body. It's just the meat suit that I was given. Get over it. Yours is not any better than mine is. But further than that, I love the radical acceptance and the joy, the curiosity. I think that for me has been a huge part of me coming out of my masculine. I did not realize how long I had stayed in primarily my masculine. That was what got me through my childhood. I'm sure it's what got me through my teen years. It's what got me through having all of those babies and leaving my ex-husband, with all of them until all of that. But now that I can recognize where and when there's a time for that, finding that balance a little bit better. And just because Jesus keeps coming back up, I'm going to go there. You guys are talking about the blood of Christ and how, where we're taught to consume it. So when you look at that passage in the New Testament, when Jesus is doing the Lord's Supper, he says, "This is my body, which is broken for you," which is the bread that you eat. And then he says, "This is my blood that was spilled for you." But if you think about it, the body is the only physical thing that made him male. The body is the only thing that made Jesus male. If Jesus were to come back today, there is no way in hell he'd come back as a dude. No way. Nobody would listen to him. Nobody would listen to him. It'd be what they are expecting, and God does not move in the way that people expect. That's not how the universe works. That's why plans don't usually work the way that we want them to. It might get us to where we want to go, but that might not be what the universe has for you, and that's so looking at even scripture in that kind of way. Like I see so much. Yes, there are lots of churches and religious practices that take that as we have to physically practice this. But if you look at what Jesus was actually saying, he broke all of, he let go of his body, and the blood that he had inside was just, it didn't matter. It was like the soul was what was important at the point. Like that's what you're trying to get through, is what is inside the meat suit. But when it's taught the way that it is, when it is interpreted the way that it is, even Christ itself, Christ wasn't a last name. That's not how that worked. There are lots of religions that think that John the Baptist was actually the original Messiah, but they killed him first. And so Jesus had to pick up the mantle and to continue. John the Baptist was married to Mary Magdalene. Jesus went on to marry Mary after John the Baptist passed, because they were cousins. That was next of kin. That is literally how scriptural time works. But when you put all Christ and take that away from Jesus at that point, and it's an energy, it's a frequency. If you're supposed to be drinking Christ's blood, what is that actually? You want to talk about Sophia and Mary Magdalene and all of the women energy. That's where our blood comes from. It's the blood of our mothers. It's not the blood of our father, but it makes that all much more a reason to find a way to balance the whole, because Jesus doesn't just take just the bread or just the wine or just the blood. It's both. It's an embodiment of both. I think one of the biggest things for women right now, especially if anybody's in the same boat of feminine rage that I am, finding that space for compassion and patience still for men is very hard right now, because we're all we need the women's groups right now. We need, do you not see what is going on? And we see the importance and the need for those things to be kind of built a little bit first before we open it up in a way that we cannot support men. Those kinds of things make sense. But also navigating it, and just my meat suit as a human, this is shit sometimes, man. It's hard. It's frustrating. A bunch of these men are so far behind. It's when are you going to get here? This is, and I'm not this is why boundaries are so important, and why it is so important that you do have that sense of self. Lean into that sense of play, that curiosity, that understanding of your feminine rage to a degree, or making friends with those parts so that you can recognize, I can coexist with fear and peace at the same time. My shame can be present, and I do not have to listen to her. I do not have to let her take the microphone. That's still but that's the beauty in duality. That is I don't think that there are feminine emotions and masculine emotions. I think there are human emotions that some men are afraid of and some women are afraid of, but it is, and it's not to say that you don't have narcissism or people that go to those extremes, but that's not how the brain is just born into the world. That is human development, that is human trauma, that is lots of different things. And so when you start looking at you as a woman as, these parts that are negative, they're not negative. They are here for a reason. Internal parts therapy or internal family systems, that's what it was. That therapy system really changed my perspective on those, because we're busy shaming down things that we think aren't good enough, or they're too big, or they're too noisy. But the reality is those are all parts of our systems, male or female. And the second you learn to integrate them, it's like Jesus sitting there at the Last Supper with all the disciples. That's the only way I know how to explain it, because that's how my brain relates it. But for me, that's been the most important part of the journey, is recognizing that all of my parts are welcome at the table. Even if I don't like that part, they still have to have a seat at the table, because if I'm not giving them a seat, it's like all of the other people that have taken my voice before me. And I'm re-traumatizing myself over and over again. Whether I consciously am aware of that or not does not matter. But choosing to stay in that pattern, nothing changes until something changes. So even if the next choice I make is messy, it's going to be different than the one I made before, because I am not doing that again,
Yeah. And taking accountability, that's, I think, the difference, is yes, we may make a mess, but we understand that I've got to clean up that mess because I made it, but I made it because I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not, to go back to what Julia said in the beginning, who I am when I'm not being coaxed or cajoled or caged. Who and what does it look like? And sometimes it is going to be messy, exactly like you said. And Jill, just to go back to what you were saying about all the parts being welcome at the table, we're including the Judas in us as well, right? The person where we sabotage ourselves, where we're not infallible people. We do make mistakes. There's no thing to say that women don't have accountability too, that they don't have, the negative emotions in the shadow side. But I can tell you now that these levels of conversation are not happening as frequently on the other side, and they need to be, like you said, the voices and the conversations need to be had on both sides of the genders. And like I said, it's not like we've all said, sorry, it's not a man versus woman thing. And in fact, gender doesn't even come into it. It's a human thing. Everybody needs to start being treated as human. But I really wanted to talk about this topic because I'm so passionate about it as a woman who's had to fight so hard for her own sovereignty, not only in her career of healthcare in South Africa, which is traditionally a male-dominated industry, but also in my spiritual career, having to fight for my voice and for the validity of the work. Tam and I have spoken a lot about this, the validity of the type of spiritual work that we do, and having to actually be taken seriously as people that are pretty educated on what we're talking about, pretty experienced, And Jill, you've experienced it as being a new voice with a new interpretation in the biblical world. It's not easily accepted. And so what I was trying to bring to the table today, which I think we've discussed amazingly, poignantly and profoundly, is that women don't fit into boxes. Women are not as simple as the dishwasher or the baby maker or the pleasure objects. Like, I understand that we may have been labeled like that, and I understand that we are far too complex beings for you to be able to fully describe us. We can't even describe ourselves. We get that. But rather, let's leave a nebulous, open vastness that can be revered instead of squashed or minimized or diminished, because the truth is, there is power here. There is power here for the taking, and power that can be used for positive, powerful change. And I thank you for being part of this conversation. And I just love to hear from all of you, your closing thoughts or anything else that you'd like to add before we set the world on fire with our episode. Tam, closing thoughts?
I think the power and veracity that's just come out of this last little section. I think, Jill, you just, I don't think I could top anything that you just laid out in that last little stretch that you did. Like, wow,
I don't know where that came from, man. That came out of nowhere.
It came from the divine feminine is where that came from, like all from the creation, man. Like that was some powerful stuff. All parts of me are welcome at the table, and then Leonie, you adding in, and that includes the Judas. I'm just like, part of me wants to stand up and say, preach, sister, preach. That's why, like, ministry is definitely your life. Like, absolutely. There's just so much. Like I say, we have so like a long distance to go in this whole rising feminine movement. I think we're at the beginnings of it. But I think that through more dialogue like this, through more conversations, and we've got to do it across both sides. I know I'm having a conversation with Chad Peterson in this month, and we're talking about the male perspective in the rising feminine. When I reached out to him, I'm like, do you want to weigh on the subject? And he was like, oh my God, this is so needed. Like, we have to have this conversation. So it's not a man versus woman, and I try and shy away from the word feminine, and I lean in the word more yin, yin and yang. It's a little bit more palatable, because when we're saying, it's the feminine rising, men instantly are like, oh, that doesn't mean us. And like, no, brothers, come. Like, you have to be part of this, because Jill, I'm going to say it again, what you said, all parts of the self have to be brought to the table, and that's in all of us. And we've got to embrace the yin and the yang in all of us. There's a woman that I've seen come up on my Facebook a few times, and she talks about this from the Chinese medicine perspective, that everything that is happening right now is actually very natural, and it's the laws of the universe that are actually coming into play, that are saying you've been way too yang for way too long. And I've said that multiple times. We've been all on the yang side of life. And nature is now stepping in and saying, no more. We've got to balance those scales, and that means bringing all the parts of ourselves together. And it's a human conversation that we've got to have. It's not just, woman, and predominantly we're being the dominant voices here because we one of the ones that have been oppressed the most. But it's a human dialogue that we're having right now here. It's not just about us, it's about all of us.
Amazing. Jules, anything you'd like to add?
I'm just really grateful that you're all here walking this journey and that we can have this conversation. It's just to think about. I mean, I'm sure these kinds of conversations have been had before, but maybe in secret, maybe very quietly. And it's nice to be able to have this conversation openly, with courage. I don't want to say without fear, because I think there's obviously a lot of hard emotion here, but the fact that that's allowed, it's a real honor to be here with all of you. So thank you.
It's an honor to have you with us, Jules, and your amazing perspective as well. All of you ladies, it's an honor to have you, and to create the space I think is important. Thank you. And Jill, your closing thoughts?
I'm with Jules. Honestly, I'm just really grateful to be a part of the conversation. Most of the things that come out of my mouth are not pre-thought. I'm not a person to sit down and take notes. I like flying by the seat of my pants in certain conversations, especially because I feel like it's more authentic, and it can help more people that way. But also, living in that space has connected so many more dots on the Christ consciousness side for me. Sometimes in the moment, like just this conversation went so many directions that I never would have gone, with my brain or my thinking had the conversation not come up, and I appreciate the space and the opportunity to share it, because all the conversations are so important. But from my perspective and my standing, the more light we can shed on these kinds of things for the people that are still in the religious trauma, religious deconstruction side, that is where this leg is so strong for me. And I'm so grateful that no matter the conversation, my perspective is welcome with the Bible, and that's not something that is that's not something that can meet me other places, but I'm grateful that this is a space that is able to see that, because there's so much importance, not to the Bible itself, but to the people that are reading that book. Like that if you don't take care of that part, it's like taking a different section out, and not including all of humanity. So yeah, I didn't expect so much Jesus to come into this conversation today, but I really love how it did, because it beautifully aligns with the feminine rising. It entirely backs the feminine rising. I think it's the upheaval the Bible's been waiting for.
Yeah, thank you. And Jill, I'm just going to hop on that just to reflect, on the three of you as panelists. I mean, I've said this to you before, Jill, in one of our previous conversations. I admire you so much as someone who has been able to come through that biblical programming, and to really have been one of the few females who've heard Jesus's message so purely in your own way, that you are now courageous enough to go back into those spaces and voice it differently, not and open up the space for healing potentially in some of those places. And again, I'm not one to be judgmental or preachy about who should be doing what, but I just think that those are the spaces where so much healing, and the spaces that are afraid of the likes of Tam and myself and Jules, that we can't get in there. We are sworn off, whereas you understand and you have this amazing space. So I think that's your unique gift, and I think it's fabulous that there's someone out there preaching compassion, not fear. And I know there'll be others. I know there are others, but in terms of the way that you're doing it from a feminine perspective, I think that is one of the hugest synchronicities in terms of our critical mass shift that we're talking about, the shift in consciousnness towards a more enlightened approach. That's one of the confirmations for me that you exist and that you're doing this. So that's amazing in that space. And then, Jules, the way that you're bringing your spirituality and your enlightened form of self-study and that kind of thing into the global spaces and the global business spaces, for me, and engineering meaningful change in the world is huge. It's going into big business and big corporate structures, and I think that that's amazing that there's a voice that and a brain far bigger than mine, but that is doing these kinds of things. Like, it's a great conversation to be having there in those spaces. It's really fantastic. And of course, Tam, my tried and trusted spiritual friend that we've walked this long many miles together, that we're still trying to engineer change and empower women and bring tarot and astrology and those demonized things back from the dark ages. Here we are doing our thing. I think it's important that not only are women having these conversations and creating these spaces, but we're also trying to embody the change we want to see in the world. That's what we're trying to do. So thank you for joining me. It was so wonderful. It was such an empowering conversation, and I can't wait to see you guys for the next episode. And thank you to all our viewers for tuning in and watching. And we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on the feminine rising and how you are unlearning your feminine role and your gender role. And we can't wait to see you until next time.